mountain man's rifle was already halfway to his shoulder before his mind fully registered what his eyes had seen. A woman on horseback surrounded by 5 cowboys whose intentions were written plain as day across their leering faces. Ryder Sullivan had been tracking elk through the foothills above Wilcox, Arizona for the better part of 3 days when he heard the commotion echoing up through the canyon. He'd left his cabin in the high country 2 weeks prior, needing supplies and perhaps a few moments of civilization before the isolation drove him to talking to the trees again. At 32 years old, he'd spent the last decade in these mountains, his body hardened by the relentless demands of survival into something that resembled more sculpture than man. His dark hair fell past his shoulders, tied back with a strip of leather, and his arms were corded with muscle that rippled beneath his sun-weathered skin whenever he moved. The woman below was struggling to control her bay mare, the horse sensing the predatory energy of the men who had positioned themselves in a loose circle around her. Even from 200 yards up the slope, Ryder could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she held the reins with white-knuckled determination. She was young, perhaps mid-20s, with dark hair pinned up beneath a practical riding hat, and she wore a split riding skirt that marked her as someone who actually knew how to handle a horse, rather than one of those Eastern ladies who rode side saddle and fainted at the sight of dust. Ryder spurred his massive roan gelding forward, the horse picking its way down the rocky slope with the sure-footedness of an animal that had navigated far worse terrain. As he descended, he could make out the men's words carrying on the October wind. "Now why's a pretty thing like you riding out here all alone?" one of them called out, his voice dripping with false concern. "Ain't safe for a woman without protection." "I appreciate your concern, gentlemen, but I'm perfectly capable of managing my own affairs," the woman responded, her voice steady despite the circumstances. There was an Eastern refinement to her accent, but it was tempered with something harder, something that suggested she'd already learned a few harsh lessons about the Western territories. "Oh, we ain't concerned, sweetheart," another cowboy laughed, nudging his horse closer. "We're offering our services, so to speak." "I'm declining those services." Her voice had gone flat now, dangerous. "Move aside." Ryder was close enough now to see the men clearly. They wore the dusty clothes of ranch hands, but there was something about them that suggested they'd recently found themselves unemployed and looking for trouble to pass the time. The one doing most of the talking had a scar that ran from his left eye down to his jaw, and he sat his horse with the casual arrogance of a man who'd never faced real consequences for his actions. "Now that's just rude," Scarface said, reaching out to grab the mare's bridle. "We're just trying to be friendly." That was when Ryder cleared his throat, loud enough to cut through their conversation like a knife. 5 heads swiveled in his direction, and he watched various expressions flicker across their faces: surprise, calculation, and in the case of 2 of the younger ones, genuine fear. Ryder understood. He cut an imposing figure at the best of times, standing well over 6 feet with shoulders that seemed to span half the horizon. But up here in his element, with 3 weeks of beard on his face and the kind of stillness that came from hours of waiting for the perfect shot, he knew he looked like something that had stepped out of a nightmare. "Afternoon," he said quietly, his voice carrying despite its low timbre. "Seems like the lady's made her wishes clear." "This ain't your business, friend," Scarface said, though his hand had dropped from the mare's bridle. "We're just having a conversation." "Conversation's over." Ryder's rifle rested casually across his saddle, but every man there could see how easily it could be raised and fired. "You boys best head back to wherever you came from. There's 5 of us and 1 of you," one of the younger cowboys pointed out, though his voice cracked slightly on the last word. Ryder smiled, and it wasn't a pleasant expression. "I've dealt with worse odds. Usually works out in my favor." He paused, letting that sink in. "Of course, I'm a reasonable man. You 5 ride out right now. Nobody has to learn whether I'm bluffing or not." The woman had maneuvered her mare slightly away from the circle, putting space between herself and the cowboys while they were distracted. Ryder noticed and approved she had good instincts. Scarface stared at Ryder for a long moment, clearly weighing his options. Whatever he saw in the mountain man's eyes must have decided him, because he finally jerked his head toward his companions. "Come on, boys, ain't worth the trouble." "But what?" one of them started. "I said come on." Scarface wheeled his horse around with more force than necessary. Plenty of other entertainment in Wilcox. The 5 men rode off, occasionally glancing back over their shoulders. Ryder kept his rifle ready until they disappeared around a bend in the trail, then finally allowed himself to relax slightly. He turned his attention to the woman, who was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read, relief mixed with wariness and something else, something that made the corners of her mouth quirk upward despite the situation she'd just escaped. "Thank you," she said simply. "I had a knife in my boot, but I was very much hoping I wouldn't have to use it." "Smart to have backup," Ryder acknowledged, nudging his gelding closer. "Though 5 against 1 are poor odds, even with a knife. What are you doing out here alone?" "I was visiting a homestead about 10 miles north," she explained, gathering her reins more securely now that her hands had stopped shaking. "The Hendersons, they're clients of mine. I'm a teacher, and I was discussing the possibility of holding classes for their children and a few others in the area. I left later than intended, and those men must have seen me on the road and followed." "You rode 10 miles out and planned to ride 10 miles back in a single day?" Ryder shook his head. "That's ambitious, even for someone who clearly knows their way around a horse." "I've made the journey before without incident," she said, a hint of defensiveness creeping into her tone. "Though I'll admit today's excitement was not part of my original itinerary." Ryder studied her more carefully now that the immediate danger had passed. She was beautiful in an unconventional way. Her face was more interesting than pretty, with strong cheekbones and a determined set to her jaw that suggested she'd had to fight for whatever she'd achieved. Her eyes were a striking amber color, almost golden in the afternoon sun, and they met his gaze directly without the coy evasion he'd seen in so many women who'd been taught that direct eye contact was somehow improper. "Where are you headed?" he asked. "Back to Wilcox. I have rooms above the general store." "I'll ride with you." It wasn't a question. She opened her mouth as if to protest, then seemed to think better of it. "That would be appreciated, Mr. Sullivan, Ryder Sullivan." "Katherine Dawson." She extended her hand, and when he shook it, he was surprised by the firmness of her grip. "Most people call me Kate. Most people call me Ryder, or occasionally less flattering things, depending on how long they've known me." That earned him a genuine smile, and Ryder felt something shift in his chest, a sensation he hadn't experienced in so long he'd almost forgotten what it felt like. He pushed the feeling aside and gestured toward the trail that led down toward Wilcox. "We should get moving. Still got a few hours of riding ahead, and I'd rather reach town before dark." They rode side by side where the trail allowed it, falling into single file when the path narrowed through rocky sections. Kate proved to be an excellent rider, keeping pace without complaint even when the terrain grew challenging. As they traveled, they talked, the conversation flowing with surprising ease. "How long have you been living in the mountains?" Kate asked as they navigated around a tumble of boulders. 10 years, give or take. Came out west after the war and just kept going until I ran out of civilization." Ryder didn't elaborate on which war or why he'd felt compelled to leave, and Kate didn't press. "Don't you get lonely?" "Sometimes." He was quiet for a moment, considering. "But there's a difference between being alone and being lonely. Out here, everything makes sense. You work hard, you survive. You make a mistake, nature doesn't care about your excuses. There's a purity to that." "That's a rather philosophical perspective for a mountain man," Kate observed, and there was no mockery in her tone, just genuine interest. "Being alone gives you plenty of time to think. Maybe too much." He glanced at her. "What about you? Teaching's a respectable profession, but it doesn't usually lead people to the Arizona territory. Most teachers I've known prefer places with actual school buildings." Kate laughed, and the sound was warm and unguarded. "Fair point. I came from Philadelphia 2 years ago. My father was a professor, very respected, very proper. He had my entire life planned out. I was to marry a colleague of his, a man twice my age who collected butterflies and had the personality of damp cardboard. I'm guessing you declined the opportunity." "Spectacularly. I told him I'd rather eat glass than spend my life as decoration in some stuffy academic's home. We exchanged some words that probably can't be repeated in polite company, and I used the small inheritance my mother left me to buy a train ticket as far west as the money would take me. That took courage. Or stupidity. Some days I'm still not sure which." She ducked under a low-hanging branch, the movement graceful and practiced. "But I love it here. Yes, it's difficult, and yes, there are days when I miss hot baths and bookstores and theaters, but there's also freedom here, Real freedom, the kind that lets you build something with your own hands rather than just inheriting someone else's expectations. Ryder understood exactly what she meant. They rode in comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds the steady clip-clop of hooves on stone and the occasional call of a hawk circling overhead. As they descended into lower elevations, the landscape gradually shifted from pine-covered slopes to the scrubby grasslands that surrounded Wilcox. The sun was sinking toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and crimson that seemed to set the whole world on fire. "It's beautiful," Kate murmured, more to herself than to Ryder. "I don't think I'll ever get tired of these sunsets." "They're different every night," Ryder agreed. "I've watched thousands of them from my cabin, and I've never seen the same one twice." Kate turned to look at him, and there was something in her expression that made Ryder's breath catch. "Do you ever think about coming down from the mountain? Living in town again?" "Not really. What would I do there? I'm not exactly built for civilized society anymore." "I don't know about that. You've been perfectly civilized company this afternoon." "That's because you're interesting enough to make the effort worthwhile." The words came out before Ryder could stop them, more honest than he'd intended. Kate's eyes widened slightly, and a faint blush colored her cheeks. That's quite possibly the nicest compliment I've received since arriving in Arizona," she said softly. Before Ryder could respond, they rounded a bend, and Wilcox came into view below them. The town was modest by Eastern standards, a collection of wooden buildings arranged along a main street with various side roads branching off like ribs from a spine, but it represented civilization, safety, and the end of their journey together. Ryder felt an unexpected reluctance as they guided their horses down the final stretch of trail. He'd lived alone for so long, convinced himself he preferred it that way, that this sudden desire for more time in Kate's company caught him off guard. They entered Wilcox as the last light was fading from the sky, their horses' hooves echoing on the packed dirt of the main street. A few people were still out and about, a merchant closing up his shop, a pair of cowboys heading toward the saloon, an older woman sweeping her porch. Several of them stared at Ryder with undisguised curiosity. He supposed he must look like something that had wandered out of the wilderness, which was essentially accurate. Kate guided them to the general store, a sturdy two-story building with a painted sign that read, "Henderson and Son." She dismounted with easy grace, then looked up at Ryder, who had remained on his horse. "Would you like to come up for coffee?" she asked. "It's the least I can offer after you rode all this way to ensure my safety." Ryder knew he should decline. He needed supplies, a place to stable his horse for the night, maybe a bath to wash off the accumulated grime of weeks in the wilderness. Getting involved with Kate Dawson, no matter how intriguing she was, seemed like a complication he didn't need. "Coffee sounds good," he heard himself say. Kate's smile could have lit the entire town. The apartment above the general store was small but tidy, with a main room that served as both sitting area and kitchen, and what Ryder assumed was a bedroom beyond a closed door. Books lined makeshift shelves along one wall, and a small desk by the window was covered with papers that looked like lesson plans. It was lived in and comfortable, the kind of space that reflected its occupant's personality. Kate busied herself with the coffee pot while Ryder stood somewhat awkwardly in the center of the room, suddenly very aware of how out of place he was in this domestic setting. His buckskins were stained and worn, his hair was a tangled mess, and he probably smelled like horse and wood smoke. "You can sit, you know," Kate said, glancing over her shoulder with amusement. "I promise the furniture won't bite." Ryder lowered himself into a chair by the table, which creaked ominously under his weight but held. "Sorry, been a while since I was in someone's home." "How long is a while?" 2 years, maybe 3. I came down for supplies and spent one night in a boarding house, but I wouldn't exactly call that someone's home." Kate brought 2 cups of coffee to the table and sat across from him. The warm lamplight softened her features, and Ryder found himself noticing details he'd missed before: a small scar on her chin, the way her hair was starting to come loose from its pins, the intelligence in her eyes as she studied him with the same intensity he was studying her. "Why do you really stay up there?" she asked quietly. "And don't tell me it's just because you prefer solitude. There's more to it than that." Ryder wrapped his hands around the coffee cup, using the warmth as an anchor while he decided how much to reveal. "I saw things during the war. Did things. When it was over, I couldn't figure out how to be around people anymore. Everything felt false, all that pretending that the world made sense when I'd seen proof it didn't. So you ran away? Yes? He met her gaze directly. I ran away and I've been running ever since. The mountains don't ask questions, don't expect you to be anything other than what you are. Kate reached across the table and placed her hand over his. The gesture was simple, compassionate, and it nearly undid him. I understand, she said. Maybe not the specifics, but the feeling. That sense that you don't quite fit anywhere, that everyone else got instructions for living that you somehow missed. Is that why you ran from Philadelphia? Partly, but also because I wanted to matter. Not as someone's daughter or someone's wife, but as myself. Out here, when I teach a child to read, that's real. That's something I did, something I built with my own hands and mind. Does that make sense? Perfect sense. They talked for hours, the conversation wandering through topics both profound and mundane. Kate told him about her students, the challenges of teaching children whose families needed them for labor more than learning, the small victories that kept her going. Ryder described his life in the high country, the harsh beauty of winter storms, the satisfaction of providing for himself entirely through skill and effort. The coffee grew cold in their cups as the night deepened around them. Finally, reluctantly, Ryder stood. I should go. Need to find a place for the night and get my horse settled. Kate rose with him, walking him to the door. In the small space, they stood close enough that Ryder could smell the faint scent of lavender in her hair. Will you be heading back to your cabin right away? She asked. Need to get supplies first, probably be in town a few days. I'd like to see you again, if you're willing. The directness of the statement was so typically Kate that Ryder couldn't help but smile. I'd like that too. There's a church social tomorrow evening. Nothing fancy, just the community getting together. You could come as my guest. Ryder thought about the crowded room, the curious stares, the expectation to make small talk with strangers. Everything in him wanted to refuse. What time? He asked instead. Kate's answering smile made every uncomfortable moment he knew was coming absolutely worthwhile. The next day passed in a blur of mundane but necessary tasks. Ryder arranged for his horse to be stabled, purchased the supplies he'd need for the coming winter, and against his better judgment, paid for a room at the boarding house and a bath. The proprietor, a weathered woman named Mrs. Chen, took one look at him and declared that she'd have to charge extra for the amount of dirt he was about to deposit in her tub. Ryder had only one set of decent clothes, packed away in his saddlebag for emergencies, dark trousers, a white shirt that had somehow remained relatively unstained, and a leather vest. He trimmed his beard into something more manageable than the wild tangle it had become, and tied his hair back more neatly. When he looked at himself in the small mirror above the wash basin, he barely recognized the man staring back. The church stood at the end of Wilcox's main street, a modest white building with a bell tower that probably could have used some repair. Light spilled from the open doors, and Ryder could hear voices and laughter from inside. He stood outside for a long moment, seriously considering just turning around and riding back to his cabin that very night. Then Kate appeared in the doorway, backlit by lamplight, wearing a dress the color of deep blue twilight that made her eyes look even more striking. She spotted him immediately and smiled, descending the steps to meet him. You came, she said, and there was genuine pleasure in her voice. Said I would. I know, but I was half convinced you'd change your mind. This can't exactly be your idea of a good time. Jury's still out, Ryder admitted, but seeing you in that dress is making a compelling argument in favor. Kate laughed and linked her arm through his. Come on, mountain man, time to be social. The inside of the church had been transformed for the social, with tables laden with food along one wall and space cleared in the center for dancing. At least 40 people filled the room, their conversations creating a low buzz of noise that made Ryder's shoulders tense instinctively. He was used to silence broken only by wind and wildlife, not this constant human chatter. Several heads turned as they entered, and Ryder saw recognition flicker across some faces. News traveled fast in small towns, and apparently the story of the mountain man who'd rescued the pretty teacher had already made the rounds. Kate, there you are, A plump woman with kind eyes bustled over. "And this must be Mr. Sullivan. I'm Martha Henderson. My husband owns the general store below your rooms, dear. We've heard all about your heroic intervention yesterday." "Wasn't much," Ryder muttered, uncomfortable with the attention. "Nonsense. Those men have been causing trouble around town for weeks. It's about time someone put them in their place." Martha patted his arm with maternal affection. "You'll have to tell us all about living in the mountains. Must be fascinating." Before Ryder could formulate a response, Martha had already moved on, spreading the news of his arrival to others in the room. Within minutes, Ryder found himself surrounded by curious townspeople, all asking questions and introducing themselves. A rancher wanted to know about mountain lion populations. The town doctor was interested in what kind of herbs grew at higher elevations. A young boy asked with wide-eyed enthusiasm if he'd ever fought a bear. Kate stayed close to his side, occasionally fielding questions or steering conversations toward topics that seemed less overwhelming. Ryder appreciated her presence more than he could express. Every time he felt the urge to bolt for the door, he'd catch her eye, and she'd give him a small, encouraging smile that somehow made it possible to endure another 5 minutes. The evening progressed with food and conversation. Ryder found himself gradually relaxing, at least marginally. The people of Wilcox were friendly without being intrusive, and several of them had interesting stories of their own. A former cavalry officer shared war experiences that Ryder could relate to, and a homesteader offered useful advice about dealing with wolves near livestock. Then someone started playing a fiddle, and couples began moving onto the floor for dancing. Ryder had just convinced himself he was safe from that particular social torture when Kate appeared at his elbow. "Dance with me," she said. "I don't dance. Everyone dances, you just haven't in a while." "Kate, I'll step on your feet and embarrass us both." She held out her hand. "I'm willing to risk it." Ryder looked at her hand, then at her face, and found he couldn't refuse. He let her lead him onto the floor, positioning himself as he vaguely remembered was proper. The fiddle began a waltz and they started moving. Kate was right, everyone did dance, or at least everyone could muddle through well enough to avoid disaster. Ryder was stiff at first, hyper-aware of his own awkwardness, but Kate was patient and skilled enough to compensate. Gradually, he found a rhythm, and something unexpected happened. With Kate in his arms, the crowded room seemed to fade away. The curious stares didn't matter. The noise became background rather than assault. There was just the warmth of her hand in his, the way she fit perfectly against him, the smile on her face as they moved together. "See?" she said softly. "Not so terrible." The company makes all the difference. They danced 3 more songs before Ryder needed to step outside for air. Kate came with him, and they stood on the church steps looking up at the stars scattered across the velvet black sky. "Thank you for coming tonight," Kate said. "I know it wasn't easy for you." "Worth it, though." Ryder turned to face her fully. "Kate, I'm not good at this. Haven't been around people, haven't tried to be close to anyone in longer than I care to admit. But being with you feels different. Feels right. And that terrifies me." Kate reached up and touched his face, her palm warm against his bearded cheek. "It terrifies me too. I didn't come to Arizona looking for romance. I came looking for independence, for a life built on my own terms. But then you rode down that mountain yesterday like something out of a story, and now I can't stop thinking about what it might mean if you stayed." "I can't stay. Not permanently. The mountains are where I belong." "I know. I wouldn't ask you to give up who you are." She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. "But maybe you could visit more often. Maybe we could figure out how to make this work, whatever this is." Ryder pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her in a gesture that felt both foreign and completely natural. She melted against him, her head resting on his chest, where she could probably hear the hammering of his heart. "I'd like to try," he said into her hair. "God help me, I'd really like to try." They stood like that for a long moment, 2 people who'd found something unexpected in each other, neither quite sure how to proceed, but both willing to figure it out. The next 3 days passed in a strange sort of limbo. Ryder conducted his business in town, preparing for his return to the mountains, while spending every possible moment with Kate. They took long walks through the countryside surrounding Wilcox, talking about everything and nothing. She showed him the 1-room schoolhouse where she taught, currently empty for the weekend, and he found himself charmed by the careful way she decorated it, the maps on the wall, and the books arranged neatly on shelves. "Do you have enough supplies?" he asked, noting how sparse some of the materials seemed. "We make do. The parents contribute what they can, but most families are struggling just to survive. Books are a luxury many can't afford." An idea formed in Ryder's mind, but he filed it away for later consideration. They had dinner together each evening, sometimes at the small restaurant in town, sometimes in Kate's apartment where she insisted on cooking, despite his protests that he was perfectly capable of surviving on hardtack and jerky. "That's exactly why I'm cooking," she'd said firmly. "You need a proper meal before you disappear into the wilderness again." On the third evening, after a dinner of stew and fresh bread, they sat together on the small sofa in her apartment. The lamp was turned low, casting intimate shadows across the room. Kate was leaning against Ryder, his arm around her shoulders, both of them quiet and content. "When will you leave?" Kate asked finally, voicing the question they'd both been avoiding. "Tomorrow. I need to get back before the weather turns. Winter comes early and hard in the high country." "How long before you come back down?" 2 months, maybe 3. Depends on the snow." He tightened his arm around her. "But I'll come back, Kate. I promise you that." She turned to look up at him, her amber eyes serious. "I'll be here waiting." Ryder cupped her face in his hands, thumbs gently stroking her cheeks. "I know this is fast. Know it's probably crazy. But Kate, these past few days with you have meant more to me than the last 10 years combined. I feel the same way." She leaned into his touch. "I told myself I was done with men, done with any relationship that might compromise my independence. But you don't make me feel less. You make me feel more alive, more certain, more myself than I've ever been." The kiss, when it came, felt inevitable. Ryder had been thinking about it for days, wondering what she would taste like, how she would feel against him. The reality exceeded every imagining. Kate kissed him with a passion that matched his own, her hands fisting in his shirt as she pulled him closer. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Ryder rested his forehead against hers. "I should go," he said, though he made no move to actually leave. "You should," Kate agreed, equally immobile. "But I don't want you to." "Kate." Her name was both a prayer and a warning. I know we need to be careful, to take this slowly. But Ryder, if tomorrow you're leaving for 2 or 3 months, I just want to be with you tonight. Nothing improper," she added quickly, seeing the concern in his eyes. "Just stay here on the sofa. Talk to me until we fall asleep. Give me that much at least." How could he possibly refuse? They spent the night wrapped in each other's arms, sometimes talking, sometimes sitting in comfortable silence. Ryder told her things he'd never told anyone about the nightmares that still sometimes woke him, about the brother he'd lost in the war, about the fear that he'd been alone so long he'd forgotten how to be anything else. Kate shared her own fears, the pressure she felt to prove herself, the loneliness that sometimes overwhelmed her, despite the community she'd built in Wilcox. As dawn painted the sky pink and gold, they were both still awake, neither willing to let the night end. "I have something for you," Kate said suddenly, disentangling herself from his arms. She crossed to her desk and retrieved a small book, which she pressed into his hands. "It's poetry. I thought maybe on the long winter nights you might enjoy having something to read." Ryder looked down at the worn leather cover. "Kate, I can't take this. Books are precious out here. I have plenty, and that one's my favorite, which means I want you to have it. Consider it borrowed if that makes you feel better, but I want you to have something of mine with you in that cabin." He pulled her close again, kissing the top of her head. "Thank you. I'll treasure it. And I'll be here when you come back, no matter how long it takes." Leaving was one of the hardest things Ryder had ever done. He packed his supplies, saddled his horse, and tried not to look back as he rode out of Wilcox, but at the edge of town, he couldn't help himself. He turned and saw Kate standing on the steps of the general store, her hand raised in farewell. Even from a distance, he could see she was crying. The ride back to his cabin took 2 days, and every mile felt wrong. Ryder had made this journey dozens of times over the years, always with a sense of relief as civilization fell away behind him. This time, he felt like he was leaving something vital behind, like a piece of himself was still standing on those steps with Kate. His cabin looked exactly as he'd left it, a single-room structure built from logs he'd felled himself, with a stone fireplace and a loft for sleeping. It was sparse but functional, everything he needed to survive the brutal mountain winters. He'd always thought of it as a refuge, a place where the world couldn't reach him. Now it just felt empty. The weeks passed slowly. Ryder fell back into his routines, hunting, trapping, gathering firewood for the winter, making repairs to the cabin before the snow became too deep. But everything felt different now. The silence he'd once treasured felt oppressive. The solitude that had seemed like freedom now felt like isolation. At night, he read Kate's book of poetry by firelight. The words spoke of love and loss, of beauty and pain, of all the messy, complicated emotions that made up human existence. Ryder had spent 10 years trying to avoid those emotions, and now he found himself embracing them, even the painful ones, because they connected him to Kate. He started keeping a journal, something he'd never done before. He wrote about his days, his thoughts, the things he wished he could tell Kate if she were there. It helped a little, though nothing could truly fill the void her absence created. The first snow came in early November, a light dusting that wouldn't last but signaled what was coming. Ryder stood on his porch, looking down at the valley far below, where he knew Wilcox lay, hidden beyond the horizon, and made a decision. 2 months was too long. He'd give it 1 month, get through the first heavy snows, and then he'd make the journey down no matter what the weather looked like. Meanwhile, in Wilcox, Kate was discovering that teaching became much more challenging when your mind constantly wandered to a certain mountain man. She threw herself into her work with perhaps more intensity than strictly necessary, planning elaborate lessons and spending hours with individual students who needed extra help. Her friends noticed the change in her, the distraction, the way she'd sometimes stare off into space with a small smile on her face. Martha Henderson, who'd taken Kate under her wing since her arrival in town, finally confronted her one afternoon over tea. "All right, out with it," Martha said firmly. "You've been mooning around for weeks now. I assume this has something to do with a certain Mr. Sullivan?" Kate sighed, seeing no point in denying it. "Is it that obvious?" "Dear, you're about as subtle as a cavalry charge. The question is, what are you going to do about it?" "What can I do? He lives in the mountains. I live here. We saw each other for 3 days, and now he's gone for months. It's impossible." "Nothing's impossible if you want it badly enough." Martha poured more tea, her expression thoughtful. "You know, my husband and I courted for 2 years while he was working a claim in California and I was living in Texas. We wrote letters, saw each other maybe 3 or 4 times a year. It wasn't easy, but it worked, because we both wanted it to work. That's different. You eventually ended up in the same place. Eventually being the key word. Love doesn't always follow a convenient timeline. Kate, sometimes you have to be patient and trust that if it's meant to be, you'll find a way." Kate wanted to believe that. Some days she did believe it. Other days, the doubt crept in. What if Ryder decided he was better off alone? What if the connection they'd felt had been a temporary thing, intense but not sustainable? What if she was building her hopes on something that couldn't possibly last? She tried to stay busy, to not count the days, but she counted them anyway. 30 days since he left. 40. 45. Each day felt a little longer than the last. Up in the mountains, Ryder was facing his own doubts. A major storm hit in late November, dumping 3 feet of snow and effectively cutting off access to the lower elevations for weeks. He told himself it was just as well, that trying to maintain a relationship with Kate was foolish anyway. They barely knew each other. The intensity of those 3 days had probably been an aberration, something that would fade with time and distance. But then he'd read another page of her poetry book, or remember the way she'd laughed at something he'd said, or recall the feeling of holding her in his arms, and he'd know that nothing about his feelings for Kate Dawson was fading. The storm finally broke in early December, and 3 days later, as soon as the trails were passable, Ryder packed his saddlebags and headed down the mountain. It was reckless. Another storm could hit at any time, trapping him in Wilcox for weeks or making the return journey impossible. He didn't care. He needed to see Kate, needed to know if what they'd started was real. The journey took longer than usual, the snow making travel treacherous. Ryder's gelding was sure-footed and strong, but even so, there were moments when he questioned the wisdom of this trip. Then he'd think of Kate's smile and keep pushing forward. He rode into Wilcox late on a Thursday afternoon, the town looking like something from a picture book under its blanket of snow. Lights glowed from windows, smoke curled from chimneys, and despite his usual aversion to civilization, Ryder had to admit there was something appealing about the scene. He went directly to the general store, not bothering to stable his horse first. He needed to see Kate now, needed to confirm that she was real and not something his isolated mind had invented. He took the stairs to her apartment 2 at a time, his heart pounding in a way that had nothing to do with physical exertion. He knocked on the door, perhaps more forcefully than he'd intended. The door opened, and there she was. Kate stood frozen for a moment, her eyes wide with shock, and then she launched herself into his arms with a cry that was half laugh, half sob. "You're here!" she gasped, her arms wrapped around his neck in a grip that might have been suffocating if Ryder had cared about breathing at that particular moment. "You came back." "Promised I would." He buried his face in her hair, inhaling the familiar scent of lavender. "Couldn't stay away as long as I'd planned." Kate pulled back just enough to look at him, tears streaming down her face, though she was smiling. "I was so worried. The storms have been terrible, and I thought you might be snowed in, or worse, and I had no way to know if you were all right." "I'm fine. More than fine now." He cupped her face, wiping away tears with his thumbs. "Kate, I tried to tell myself this was foolish, that we barely knew each other, that the smart thing would be to just let it go. I couldn't do it. Every day up there, all I could think about was you." "I've been the world's worst teacher for the past month," Kate confessed. "My students probably think I've lost my mind. All I could focus on was counting days and wondering when you'd come back." They stood in the open doorway, holding each other, oblivious to the cold air rushing in from outside. Finally, Kate seemed to remember herself and pulled him inside, closing the door behind them. "You must be frozen and exhausted. Let me make coffee, and you can tell me everything." Later, Ryder pulled her back into his arms. "Right now, I just need this." He kissed her with all the pent-up longing of the past month, and Kate responded with equal fervor. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, and Ryder knew with absolute certainty that this was real, this mattered, and somehow they were going to make it work. They spent the evening catching up, talking about the past month. Kate shared stories from her classroom, the progress her students were making, the small dramas of town life. Ryder described the storm, the challenges of winter survival, the endless hours he'd spent thinking about her. "I brought you something," he said, reaching into his saddlebag. He pulled out a carefully wrapped bundle and handed it to her. Kate unwrapped it to find a small, carved wooden box, intricately detailed with mountain scenes. Inside was a collection of pressed wildflowers from the high country. "I know they're not much," Ryder said, suddenly uncertain. "City folks probably give fancy jewelry or such. But I thought—" "They're perfect," Kate interrupted, her voice thick with emotion. "Ryder, they're absolutely perfect. I'll treasure them." She set the box carefully on her desk, then turned back to him. "I have something for you too, though it's not nearly as romantic." She handed him a package wrapped in brown paper. Inside, Ryder found 3 books, all well worn but in good condition. "Kate, I can't accept these. I know how much books mean to you. And now I know they mean something to you, too. I saw how much you appreciated the poetry. These are some of my other favorites. One's a novel, one's philosophy, and one's natural history that I thought you might find interesting given where you live." Ryder was genuinely moved. The gift showed that she'd been thinking about him, considering his interests, wanting to give him something meaningful. "Thank you. These will make the long winter nights much more bearable." "How long can you stay this time?" "A week, maybe a little more. I need to get back before the next big storm, but the weather should hold at least that long." A week. It wasn't much, but it was more than either of them had dared hope for a few hours ago. They made the most of every moment. Ryder met more of the townspeople, gradually becoming less uncomfortable with social interaction. Kate introduced him to her students, and he found himself telling stories about mountain life that had the children wide-eyed with fascination. One little girl asked if he'd ever seen a wolf, and before he knew it, he was describing an encounter with a pack that had been both terrifying and beautiful. "You're good with them," Kate observed later as they walked back to her apartment. "The children, I mean. They hung on your every word. They're easier than adults, more honest. They don't pretend to be something they're not. Most children don't have to. They haven't learned yet that the world expects them to fit into neat little boxes. Ryder thought about that. Is that what you're doing? Trying to teach them before they get too molded into shapes that don't fit? I'm trying to give them options. If they want to stay here and ranch or farm, wonderful. But if they want something else, if they want to read books or ask questions or dream big dreams, I want them to have the skills to do that too. That's a good thing you're doing here, Kate. Important. She squeezed his hand. Thank you. That means a lot coming from you. They attended another church social, and this time, Ryder was less awkward, more willing to engage in conversation. He even danced with Kate without feeling like the entire room was watching them, though of course, they probably were. Small towns were like that. On his fourth night in Wilcox, they had dinner with Martha and her husband, Joseph Henderson. It was a warm, friendly evening, the kind of simple domestic gathering that Ryder would have avoided like the plague a month ago. Now he found he actually enjoyed it. "So what are your intentions toward our Kate?" Martha asked bluntly over dessert, ignoring her husband's warning look. "Martha, for heaven's sake," Joseph muttered. "It's a fair question," Kate said, though her cheeks were flushed. "Though I'm perfectly capable of asking it myself if I felt the need." Ryder set down his coffee cup and met Martha's eyes directly. "My intentions are entirely honorable, madam. I care about Kate more than I've cared about anyone in longer than I can remember. I'm also realistic about the challenges we're facing. My life is in the mountains, hers is here. But I'm willing to work on finding a solution if she is." "Good answer," Martha said with satisfaction. "Kate's special. She deserves someone who sees that." "I know exactly how special she is." Later, walking back to Kate's apartment under a sky full of stars, she took his hand. "Sorry about Martha. She means well, but she's about as subtle as a stampede." "I didn't mind. She cares about you, wants to make sure you're protected. That's not a bad thing." They climbed the stairs to her apartment, and once inside, Kate turned to face him. "What you said at dinner, about finding a solution, did you mean that?" "Every word." Ryder pulled her close. "I don't have all the answers yet, Kate. I still don't know how we make this work long term, but I know I'm not willing to give up on it. On us." "Neither am I." She looked up at him, her amber eyes serious. "I've been thinking about this, about what might be possible. What if I came up to visit you? Not for long, just a few days when the weather allows. I could see your world, understand better how you live." Ryder considered that. The cabin was rough, the living conditions harsh by any standard, but the idea of showing Kate the places he loved, sharing that part of his life with her, was incredibly appealing. It would be difficult, he warned. Long ride, basic accommodations, no luxuries of any kind. "I didn't come to Arizona seeking luxury, remember? I came seeking something real. I think your mountain might be as real as it gets." "Then yes. When spring comes and the trails are clear, I'll come get you. We'll make the journey together." They sealed the promise with a kiss that started gentle and quickly became something more intense. Ryder forced himself to pull back before things went too far. He wanted Kate God. Did he want her? But he also respected her too much to compromise her reputation or her principles. "I should go," he said, his voice rough. "Back to the boarding house." Kate nodded, though she didn't release her hold on him. "I know. But Ryder, when the time is right, when we've figured this out and know where we're heading, I want you to know that I'm not afraid of any of it. Whatever happens, wherever we end up, I want to face it with you. Kate." Her name was all he could manage, his throat too tight for more words. He kissed her forehead, her cheeks, finally her lips, trying to pour everything he felt into the gesture. "Soon. I promise we'll figure this out soon." The week passed far too quickly. On the morning Ryder was scheduled to leave, they stood together in the pre-dawn darkness, neither willing to say goodbye. "I'll come back in 2 months," Ryder promised. "Maybe sooner if the weather allows. And as soon as spring comes, we'll make that trip to the cabin." "I'll count the days." Kate's smile was brave, but her eyes were wet with unshed tears. "Be safe up there, Ryder. Please." "Always am. You take care of yourself, too. And Kate, I love you. Didn't plan on it. Didn't think I was capable of it anymore. But I do. I love you. It was the first time either of them had said the words aloud, though they'd been hovering unspoken between them for days. Kate's breath caught, and then she was crying and laughing at the same time. I love you too. So much it terrifies me sometimes. They held each other as the sun began to paint the eastern sky with color, neither wanting to be the first to let go. Finally, Ryder forced himself to step back. I have to go now, or I'll never leave. Then go. But come back to me, Mountain Man. Promise you'll always come back. Always, Ryder vowed, and then he was mounting his horse and riding away, looking back once to see Kate still standing there, her hand raised in farewell. The winter seemed longer than any Ryder had experienced. The storms were frequent and fierce, and there were weeks when leaving the cabin was nearly impossible. But now, instead of the isolation feeling like sanctuary, it felt like imprisonment. He wanted to be with Kate, wanted to talk to her, hold her, simply exist in the same space. He read the books she'd given him cover to cover, some of them twice. He wrote in his journal every day, long entries that were essentially letters to Kate even though he had no way to send them. He carved more small items from wood, a set of candlesticks, a frame for a mirror, a jewelry box more elaborate than the first. He wasn't sure what he'd do with them all, but the work kept his hands busy and his mind focused on Kate rather than on the endless white landscape outside his window. In Wilcox, Kate was experiencing similar restlessness. She threw herself into teaching with renewed vigor, but the days felt interminable. She started writing her own journal, filling pages with her thoughts about Ryder, about their future, about the fears and hopes that kept her awake at night. Martha noticed Kate's distraction and made it her personal mission to keep the younger woman engaged with the community. There were sewing circles and church committees and town planning meetings, all designed to keep Kate too busy to pine. It worked mostly, though nothing could completely fill the void Ryder's absence created. February brought a brief warm spell that melted some of the snow and made travel possible again. Ryder practically ran down the mountain, making the journey to Wilcox in record time. He arrived unannounced, showing up at the schoolhouse while Kate was in the middle of a lesson on geography. Through the window, he watched her pointing to a map, explaining something to her students with the same passion and energy he'd seen before. She was beautiful in her element, confident and engaged, and Ryder felt his heart swell with pride and love. One of the students spotted him through the window and let out a small exclamation. Kate turned, following the child's gaze, and her face transformed when she saw Ryder. For a moment she seemed frozen, and then she was moving, practically running to the door. "Class dismissed early," she called over her shoulder, not taking her eyes off Ryder. "We'll continue tomorrow." The children filed out in a chattering, giggling mass, clearly delighted by this unexpected development. Ryder nodded to them as they passed, but his attention was entirely on Kate. She stopped just in front of him, as if suddenly shy. "You're here." Couldn't stay away. He reached out and took her hand. "Kate, I've been thinking about something all winter. Actually, thinking about it constantly until I nearly drove myself insane." "What is it?" "Marry me." The words came out more bluntly than he'd intended, but there was no taking them back now. "I know it's complicated. Know we still have to figure out the details, but I don't want to spend another winter wondering what we're doing. I want you to be my wife. If you'll have me." Kate's eyes went wide, her free hand flying to her mouth. "Ryder, are you serious?" "Never been more serious about anything in my life. I love you, Kate. Want to build a life with you, whatever that looks like. So what do you say? Will you marry me?" For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity. Kate didn't respond. Then she launched herself into his arms, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, yes, of course I'll marry you, you impossible man. Did you really think I'd say anything else?" Ryder spun her around, both of them laughing like children. When he set her down, he kissed her with all the love and relief and joy that was flooding through him. "We have so much to figure out," Kate said when they finally broke apart. "Where we'll live, how we'll make it work, what I'll do about the school. We'll figure it all out," Ryder assured her. "Together. That's what matters, that we're together." News of the engagement spread through Wilcox faster than a prairie fire. By evening, half the town had stopped by to offer congratulations. Martha cried and hugged them both. Joseph Henderson shook Ryder's hand with genuine warmth. Even the stern-faced minister managed to smile. "When's the wedding?" Martha demanded, already planning in her head. As soon as possible, Ryder said, looking at Kate. No reason to wait. We need at least a few weeks, Kate protested. There are arrangements to make, people to notify. My father might not approve, but I should at least tell him. Will he come? Kate shook her head. I doubt it. We haven't spoken since I left Philadelphia, but I should write to him anyway. Let him know I'm getting married and that I'm happy. They settled on 6 weeks, which would put the wedding in late March. It would still be cold, but the worst of winter would be past. Kate insisted on a proper ceremony in the church, with the whole town invited. Ryder, who would have been perfectly happy with a quick ceremony before the justice of the peace, agreed because he wanted Kate to have the wedding she deserved. The next 6 weeks were a whirlwind of preparation. Kate worked with Martha to make a dress, simple but elegant. Ryder endured multiple fittings for a suit that the town tailor insisted on making specially for the occasion. They met with the minister to discuss the ceremony. They made plans for their future, talking late into the night about how they'd balance Kate's work with Ryder's life in the mountains. I think I could teach part of the year, Kate suggested one evening. Maybe 6 or 7 months from fall through spring. Then spend summers with you in the mountains. What about the school? They need a teacher year-round. They'll have to find someone else for the summer, or combine with another district. Ryder, I'm not giving up teaching entirely, but I'm also not giving up on being your wife. We'll find a balance. You're sure? I don't want you to resent me down the line for taking you away from something you love. Kate took his face in her hands. I love teaching, but I love you more. And maybe being your wife and being a teacher don't have to be mutually exclusive. Maybe we can find a way to have both. If anyone can figure it out, it's you. The wedding day dawned clear and cold, the sky a brilliant blue that seemed almost unreal. The church was packed with what felt like every resident of Wilcox and the surrounding countryside. Kate walked down the aisle alone, having no family to give her away, but she didn't seem to mind. Her eyes were locked on Ryder, who stood at the altar in his new suit looking both uncomfortable and happier than anyone had ever seen him. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt. They exchanged vows they'd written themselves, promising to love and support each other through whatever challenges came their way. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Ryder kissed Kate with an enthusiasm that made several of the older ladies fan themselves, and the younger ones sigh with envy. The celebration afterward was boisterous and joyful, with food and music and dancing that lasted well into the night. Ryder danced with his new wife 3 times before they finally snuck away, both eager to begin their life together. They spent their wedding night in a room at the boarding house that Mrs. Chen had decorated with flowers and candles. The gestures were sweet, if slightly embarrassing, but Ryder and Kate appreciated the sentiment. Finally alone, they came together with a passion that had been building for months, expressing physically what they had already declared emotionally. Afterward, lying tangled in each other's arms, Kate traced patterns on Ryder's chest. So, husband, what happens now? Now we start figuring out our life together. He kissed the top of her head. We finish out the school term here, another few months. Then we'll head up to the cabin for the summer, give you a chance to experience mountain life before you fully commit to it. I'm already fully committed to it. I'm committed to you. Even so, you should know what you're getting into. It's isolated, Kate, hard in ways you can't imagine until you've lived it. Then I'll learn, together, remember? That's what we promised. The next few months passed in a blur of happiness. Kate continued teaching while Ryder took on odd jobs around Wilcox, helping with repairs and construction projects. It felt strange to be part of a community again, but with Kate by his side, it was bearable, even enjoyable at times. They moved Kate's belongings into a small house that Joseph Henderson offered to rent them at a very reasonable rate. It wasn't much, but it was theirs, a place to come back to when they descended from the mountains. As spring arrived and the snow in the high country began to melt, they made preparations for the journey to Ryder's cabin. Kate arranged for another teacher to take over her classes for the summer months, a young woman from Tucson who was eager for the experience. On a morning in early May, they set out together, their horses laden with supplies. The journey took 3 days, winding through increasingly rugged terrain. Kate proved to be an excellent traveler, never complaining about the long hours in the saddle or the basic camping conditions at night. When they finally arrived at the cabin, Ryder felt a moment of anxiety. The place that had been his sanctuary for so long suddenly seemed small and primitive. What would Kate think of it? But Kate dismounted and looked around with delight. "It's perfect," she breathed, taking in the cabin, the stunning mountain vistas, the crystal-clear stream that ran nearby. "Ryder, this is absolutely perfect." Relief flooded through him. "It's basic. No luxuries, no convenience, nothing like what you're used to. It's honest. It's real. It's you." She turned to him with a smile. "Show me everything. I want to know all of it." They settled into a routine over the coming weeks. Ryder taught Kate the skills she'd need to survive in the mountains: how to fish, how to preserve meat, how to identify edible plants and dangerous animals. Kate proved to be a quick learner, approaching mountain life with the same intelligence and determination she brought to everything else. In the evenings, they'd sit on the porch, watching the sunset over the peaks while discussing books or simply enjoying comfortable silence. Sometimes they'd make love under the stars, the privacy of their isolated location freeing them from the constraints of civilization. Kate thrived in the mountains in a way that surprised even her. The physical labor, the constant challenges, the intimate connection with the natural world, all of it resonated with something deep inside her. She understood now why Ryder had been drawn to this life, why he'd needed it. But she also saw the isolation through fresh eyes, the way days could pass without human contact beyond each other, the harsh realities of survival that wore on a person year after year. "I can see why you love it here," she said one evening as they sat together watching the stars emerge. "But I also see why it would be lonely. Spending every winter up here alone, no one to talk to, nothing but survival to focus on. That's hard, Ryder." "It is," he admitted. "Harder than I let myself acknowledge for a long time. Having you here has made me realize just how lonely I was before." "Then we don't do it that way anymore. We spend winters in Wilcox where I can teach and you can take on work that keeps us connected to the community. Summers we come up here, have this as our sanctuary rather than your prison. Best of both worlds." Ryder pulled her closer. "You'd be willing to do that? Split our time like that?" "I think it's perfect. We get the peace and beauty of this place when we need it, but we also have purpose and community in Wilcox. Neither of us has to give up what we need." It was a good plan, and as the summer progressed, they refined it further. Ryder began thinking about ways to make the cabin more comfortable for extended stays, maybe adding a room, improving the roof, building better storage. Kate talked about bringing some of her books up, maybe even some teaching materials so she could continue preparing lessons during the summer months. They made love frequently and enthusiastically, their passion for each other only growing stronger. In late July, Kate began feeling unwell in the mornings, and it didn't take long for both of them to realize what that meant. "A baby," Kate whispered, her hand on her still flat stomach. "Ryder, we're going to have a baby." Ryder felt a wave of emotion so intense it nearly knocked him over. Joy, fear, wonder, responsibility, all of it crashing over him at once. "Are you happy about it?" "Terrified," Kate admitted. "But yes, happy. So happy I could cry. Are you?" Ryder pulled her into his arms, holding her like she was the most precious thing in the world, which she was. "I never thought I'd have this. A wife, a family, a real life. Kate, you've given me everything I didn't even know I wanted." They decided to head back to Wilcox in late August, earlier than originally planned. Kate needed proper medical care, and while the mountain had taught them both self-sufficiency, this was too important to risk. The journey down was slower, Ryder being excessively careful with Kate's comfort and safety. Wilcox welcomed them back with enthusiasm, and when the news of the pregnancy spread, the whole town seemed to celebrate. Martha immediately took charge, making sure Kate had everything she needed and offering endless advice drawn from raising her own 5 children. The autumn passed peacefully. Kate returned to teaching, though she planned to stop when she got further along. Ryder took a job helping build an addition onto the church, work that kept him busy and allowed him to contribute to the community in a meaningful way. He discovered, to his surprise, that he didn't hate living in town as much as he'd expected. With Kate by his side and a purpose to his days, civilization was more bearable. He still looked forward to their summers in the mountains, but Wilcox was starting to feel like home too. Winter arrived with the usual cold and snow, but this time Ryder weathered it in the warmth of his house, with his wife beside him and their child growing inside her. The contrast to previous winters spent alone in his cabin was almost overwhelming. Kate continued teaching through December, finally stopping after Christmas when her condition became too obvious to ignore. She spent the winter months preparing for the baby, sewing clothes and blankets with Martha's help, reading everything she could find about childbirth and infant care. Ryder was simultaneously excited and terrified. He'd faced down wild animals, survived brutal storms, endured war and isolation, but the thought of becoming a father scared him more than anything he'd ever experienced. What if he wasn't good enough? What if he couldn't provide properly? What if something went wrong? Kate, sensing his anxiety, took his hand one evening in late February. "You're going to be an amazing father," she said firmly. "I know you're scared. I am too. But we'll figure it out together, just like we've figured out everything else." "What if I mess it up?" "I didn't have a great example, Kate. My own father was hard, distant. What if that's all I know how to be?" "That's not all you know. You're gentle with me, patient when you're teaching me things, protective without being controlling. Those are exactly the qualities a child needs. And Ryder, you already broke the cycle just by worrying about it. You care enough to want to do better, and that's what matters." Her faith in him was humbling and reassuring in equal measure. The baby came in early March, after a labor that lasted 14 hours and left both Kate and Ryder exhausted. But when the midwife placed the squalling infant in Kate's arms, every moment of pain and fear was worth it. "It's a boy," the midwife announced with satisfaction. "Good strong lungs on him." Ryder stared at his son in absolute wonder. The baby was tiny, red-faced and wrinkled, and the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen after Kate herself. "What should we name him?" Kate asked, looking up at Ryder with tired but joyful eyes. They'd discussed names, but never settled on anything definite. Now, looking at the new life they'd created together, Ryder knew exactly what felt right. "Thomas," he said softly, "after my brother, the one I lost in the war, if that's all right with you." Kate's eyes filled with tears. "Thomas Sullivan. It's perfect." The town rallied around them as new parents, bringing food and supplies and endless unsolicited advice. Ryder, who'd once avoided human contact at all costs, found himself genuinely grateful for the support of this community they'd become part of. Fatherhood changed him in ways he couldn't have anticipated. The fierce protectiveness he'd felt toward Kate extended to his son, magnified beyond reason. Every cry sent him rushing to check on Thomas. Every milestone, no matter how small, filled him with pride that seemed disproportionate to the achievement. Kate watched her husband with their son and fell in love with him all over again. The mountain man who'd saved her from those cowboys had revealed depths of gentleness and care she'd only glimpsed before. As spring arrived and the mountain trails cleared, they had to make a decision. Would they spend the summer in the high country with an infant? It would be challenging, potentially dangerous, but the alternative was spending months in town, giving up the part of their rhythm that recharged them both. "We go to the cabin," Kate said firmly when they discussed it. "We'll be careful, we'll prepare thoroughly, but we don't give up on that part of our lives. Thomas is part of this family, which means he's part of both worlds too." The journey up to the cabin with a 3-month-old required more planning than their previous trips. They brought extra supplies, more equipment, and went slowly to accommodate Kate's nursing schedule and Thomas's needs. But they made it, settling into the cabin with a sense of coming home. The summer passed in a blur of new experiences. They baby-proofed the cabin as best they could, taking turns watching Thomas while the other worked. Kate proved remarkably adept at balancing motherhood with the demands of mountain living, often wearing Thomas in a sling she'd made while going about her tasks. Ryder had feared that fatherhood would diminish his relationship with Kate, but instead, it deepened it. Watching her with their son, seeing the family they'd built together, only made him love her more. They established a new routine that incorporated all three of them. Mornings were for chores and work. Afternoons they'd explore together, taking short hikes with Thomas bundled up against Kate's chest. Evenings were family time, sitting together on the porch, talking and laughing while Thomas gurgled happily or nursed or slept. "This is everything I never knew I wanted," Ryder said one evening, his arm around Kate while Thomas dozed in her lap. "A family, a real life, purpose beyond just survival." "You saved me that day," Kate reminded him, "not just from those cowboys, but from a life where I was just going through the motions. You gave me adventure and love, and now this." She looked down at their son. "I'm the one who should be grateful." "We saved each other," Ryder corrected. "That's how the best partnerships work." As August arrived and they prepared to return to Wilcox, neither of them felt the reluctance they might have expected. They'd had their mountain time, recharged and reconnected, but they were also ready to return to community, to Kate's teaching, to the other part of their lives. The pattern they had established summers in the mountains, the rest of the year in Wilcox worked beautifully. Thomas thrived in both environments, growing into a healthy, curious toddler who seemed equally comfortable in the wilderness and the town. 2 years after Thomas was born, Kate found herself pregnant again. This time, the process felt less terrifying and more exciting. They knew what to expect, felt confident in their ability to handle the challenges of parenthood. Their daughter was born in December, during a snowstorm that trapped the midwife in their house for 3 days. They named her Sarah after Kate's mother, and she proved to have her mother's determination and her father's quiet intensity from the very beginning. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm. Ryder took pride in being a provider for his family, not just through hunting and trapping during the summers, but through honest work in Wilcox during the winters. He built furniture, did carpentry, helped other homesteaders with various projects. He was no longer the isolated mountain man who'd rode down to save a woman surrounded by cowboys. He was Ryder Sullivan, respected member of the community, husband, father, and friend. Kate balanced teaching with motherhood, often bringing her children to school with her when they were small. She'd expanded her educational efforts, not just teaching children, but also offering evening classes for adults who wanted to improve their reading and writing. The schoolhouse became a center of community learning, and Kate's reputation as an excellent teacher spread throughout the territory. The years passed, marked by the changing seasons and the steady growth of their children. Thomas grew into a lanky boy who loved the mountains as much as his father did, often begging to spend extra time at the cabin. Sarah was more bookish, preferring to curl up with her mother's collection of books, though she was no less capable in the wilderness. When Thomas was 10 and Sarah was 8, Kate became pregnant again, a surprise that delighted them all. Their third child, a boy they named James, arrived in spring, timing his entrance for right before they were to head to the cabin for the summer. 3 children, Ryder marveled, holding his youngest son while watching his other children play in the yard. "Never thought I'd have even one, and now we have 3. "Do you ever regret it?" Kate asked, leaning against him. "Leaving the solitary life for this chaos?" Ryder looked at his wife, still beautiful despite the exhaustion of new motherhood, then at his children, healthy and happy and full of life. "Not for a single second. You gave me everything, Kate. You gave me a reason to come down from that mountain and rejoin the world. I'd live that day over again 1,000 times if it meant ending up here with you." "Good answer," Kate said with a smile, then kissed him with the same passion they'd shared from the very beginning. The Sullivan family became a fixture in Wilcox. Ryder served on the town council, using his knowledge of the surrounding wilderness to help with water management and land use decisions. Kate's school flourished, and she began training other teachers, expanding education throughout the region. As the children grew older, the summers in the mountain cabin remained sacred family time. They'd make the journey together, pack up their lives for 3 months, and disappear into the high country. Thomas proved to be a natural outdoorsman, learning tracking and hunting from his father. Sarah developed a keen interest in botany, cataloging the plants they found. James, always the most social of the 3, somehow made friends with every creature they encountered, from squirrels to deer. The cabin had grown over the years, expanding from a single room to a proper house with multiple bedrooms and modern conveniences that Ryder would have scoffed at in his solitary days. But it still retained the essence of what had made it special: the peace, the beauty, the connection to something primal and real. Kate wrote during these summer months, documenting their experiences, writing stories for children that drew on their unique lifestyle. She eventually got several published, creating another source of income for the family and spreading their story beyond the Arizona territory. When Thomas turned 18, he announced his intention to become a guide, leading hunting and fishing expeditions into the high country. Ryder helped him establish the business, teaching him everything he knew about survival and safety. It was a proud moment, watching his son take the lessons of mountain life and build something of his own from them. Sarah, as expected, pursued education. She attended a teacher's college in California, then returned to Wilcox to work alongside her mother, eventually taking over many of Kate's classes as Kate focused more on administration and teacher training. James surprised everyone by developing an interest in medicine. He apprenticed with Wilcox's doctor, then went east for formal medical training, returning 5 years later as Dr. James Sullivan, ready to serve his community. Through it all, Ryder and Kate remained the center of their family, their love for each other, the foundation everything else was built on. They still took walks together in the evenings, still talked for hours about everything and nothing, still looked at each other with the same wonder and affection they'd felt in those first intense days. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Ryder took Kate back to the spot where he'd first seen her surrounded by those cowboys. It was a warm spring day, the landscape green and beautiful, so different from that October afternoon when their lives had collided. "Do you remember what you thought when you first saw me?" Kate asked, holding his hand as they looked out over the valley. "I thought you were in trouble and needed help," Ryder said honestly. "And then I got closer and saw how you were handling yourself, and I thought maybe you were going to be fine on your own. But I'm real glad I intervened anyway." "So am I. Best day of my life, even if it started with 5 men with questionable intentions surrounding me." She turned to face him fully. "You know what I thought when I saw you riding down that mountain?" "What?" "I thought, now there's a man. Not because of how you looked, though that certainly didn't hurt, but because of how you moved, how you spoke. There was a certainty to you, a confidence that came from knowing exactly who you were. And then you risked yourself to help a stranger, asking nothing in return. And I thought, I need to know this man. I'm glad you decided that. Can't imagine my life without you in it." Kate moved into his arms, fitting perfectly against him the way she always had. 20 years, 3 children, 2 homes. More happiness than I ever dreamed possible. Not bad for a mountain man and an Eastern teacher who happened to cross paths. "Not bad at all." Ryder kissed the top of her head. "Here's to 20 more, and 20 after that, and as many as we're blessed to have." They stood together in the place where their story had begun, 2 people who'd found each other against all odds and built something beautiful from that chance encounter. Behind them lay 2 decades of shared experiences, challenges overcome, joys celebrated. Ahead lay whatever the future would bring, faced together. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, they mounted their horses and rode back toward Wilcox, back to their family, their community, their life. The mountain would still be there when summer came, waiting for them as it always did. But for now, they had an anniversary dinner to attend, hosted by their children and half the town, because the story of how the mountain man saved Kate Dawson and found his own salvation in the process had become legend in Wilcox. And every word of it was true. Years continued to pass, each one adding depth to the Sullivan family story. Thomas married a rancher's daughter and built a cabin near his father's, continuing the tradition of summer mountain living while adding his own chapter. Sarah found love with a fellow teacher, a kind man who appreciated her intelligence and shared her passion for education. James married a nurse he'd met during his medical training, and together they established a small hospital in Wilcox that served families for miles around. Ryder and Kate became grandparents, then great-grandparents, their family tree spreading and growing like the pines that surrounded their mountain cabin. Through it all, they maintained their rhythm winters in Wilcox, summers in the high country, always together, always in love. On Ryder's 65th birthday, the family gathered at the cabin for a celebration. 3 generations of Sullivans filled the expanded structure and spilled out onto the porch and grounds. Ryder stood with Kate, surveying their descendants, and felt overwhelming gratitude. "Never thought I'd see this day," he said quietly to Kate. "Never thought I'd have any of this, but you did. We did." Kate squeezed his hand. "All because you were brave enough to ride down that mountain and help a stranger. Best decision I ever made." As the celebration continued around them, filled with laughter and love and life, Ryder reflected on the journey that had brought him here. The war that had broken him, the isolation that had almost consumed him, the chance encounter that had saved him. Meeting Kate hadn't just given him love, it had given him redemption, purpose, a reason to rejoin the human race. And Kate, looking at the family they'd built together, felt the same gratitude. She'd fled Philadelphia seeking freedom and found so much more. She'd found partnership, passion, purpose, and a love that had sustained her through decades. The mountain man, who'd appeared like something from a storybook, had turned out to be the most real thing she'd ever known. That evening, after the family had settled down and the younger ones had gone to bed, Ryder and Kate sat together on the porch, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. They didn't need words anymore. After 35 years of marriage, they could communicate in silence, in touches, in shared glances. But Ryder spoke anyway, because some things deserved to be said aloud. "I love you, Kate Sullivan. Have from the moment you stood up to those Cowboys with nothing but determination and a hidden knife. Will love you until my last breath and probably beyond." "And I love you, Ryder Sullivan. My mountain man, my protector, my partner in everything. Thank you for riding down that mountain all those years ago. Thank you for seeing me, for choosing me, for building this beautiful life with me." They sat together under the stars, two people who'd found each other when they both needed salvation and created something that would echo through generations. Their children, their grandchildren, their great-grandchildren, all of them existed, because a mountain man saw a woman in trouble and decided to help, and because that woman was brave enough to trust him, to love him, to build a life with him. It was a simple story in many ways. Boy meets girl, boy saves girl, they fall in love. But like all great love stories, it was the details that mattered, the challenges overcome, the compromises made, the daily choice to love and be loved. It was summer mountains and winter towns, teaching and building, raising children and growing old together. And as the night deepened around them, Ryder and Kate sat in perfect contentment, knowing they'd found what most people only dreamed of: true partnership, lasting love, and a life well lived. The mountain behind them stood eternal and unchanging, a silent witness to all they'd built, all they'd become. From that first moment when Ryder Sullivan rode up to help Kate Dawson surrounded by 5 cowboys with bad intentions, to this perfect evening, surrounded by family and love, their story had unfolded exactly as it was meant to. Not easy, not without challenges, but always together, always moving forward, always choosing each other. And that made all the difference.